Well, parts 1 and 2 of Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths were at times a struggle for me to get through, but part 3 really put them in a new light. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. The IMDb synopsis for Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3 reads, "Trapped in a pocket universe, surviving Earths face annihilation by the Anti-Monitor. Time shatters, bringing past heroes to aid Justice League. I think there's a missing the in there. Aid the Justice League against the epitome of evil. Their sacrifice may lead to victory." May being the operative term here. As far as the story and the tone and what this thing basically feels like, first off, I am going to talk what I would consider some minor spoilers, mostly just spoilers about some cameos, because I think it's relevant to kind of what this thing does in terms of how it wraps up DC animated stuff. But really, I think the power of these cameos is not in the surprise that they're happening and like, oh, what are they touching on? Who are they referencing? What continuities? What past animated stuff are they, but rather how they're presented, is I think the most powerful part of them. Anyway, if you want my review of part 1, you can go check the Christian Geek Central channel. My review of part 2 is episode 809 of the Christian Geek Central podcast. My gripes with this one, there's some that carry over from the first two. There are too many moving pieces and numerous characters whose versions here in what's been the Tomorrowverse era of DC animated projects that have this shared continuity, much like I can't remember what it was called before then, but it was clearly based on DC's 52 or DC's New 52. I think it was, the New 52 iteration of the DC universe. But this is the Tomorrowverse. I really didn't get into, largely because of the art style. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I wasn't invested really in these versions of these DC characters, but my comic fandom, as someone who has loved DC's characters since, for the last 40 years, some of my earliest memories are, watching the Super Friends. I have foggy memories of first really loving Green Lantern and being fascinated with him with that show. And of course, once I was in my early teens, I started reading comic books and eventually was buying and reading them weekly. And that went on for years. And with a significant gap in there, has then resumed and continued to this day. DC is my universe. And so my fandom, despite not being familiar with these particular versions of these characters, I know all these characters, or at least know of all of them, and are familiar to some degree with the personalities, the stories, the origins, all that kind of stuff of virtually every character that appeared here. And so, but I think that only partially overcomes the lack of connection that I wanted to feel with this trilogy and its characters. To capture what the original Crisis on Infinite Earths was, which was published back in 84, 85, or is it 85, 86? Anyway, mid-80s. They, I think, should have leaned into genuine past animated iterations. They should have been having characters from the Super Friends, characters from Bruce Timm's animated universe, not just in cameos, but like as major players in the story, much like the Golden Age Superman and the Silver Age characters, these Golden Age characters, and all these other then existing universes. Their characters were very much in play, and so they were bringing into Crisis on Infinite Earths what had come before, and they just weren't doing that near as much here. There were some parallel universes that they just kind of made up on the spot, seemingly for this story, rather than really leaning on, especially, I think, the Bruce Timm animated universe, which, this story, I think, adapting the story that was originally written in the mid-80s, well, written before then, published in the mid-80s. It's for older fogies like me, it's for guys in their, or readers, I should say, in their 40s, their 50s, maybe their 60s, depending on how old they would have been at the time they were reading those comics. Maybe it's also for those who are really invested in the DC universe today, but I don't know. It's like they were trying to show us it's like they didn't know exactly what to be faithful to and where to draw from. And so they were trying to be faithful to and draw from so many different places, some stuff that like just seemed straight from the comics, like that had not been existent in any. I don't know. There's a brief appearance by the Losers, which they got a live action movie that didn't do very well a number of years ago. I'm trying to remember if the Losers actually got an animated anything in the Tomorrowverse or anything before it. But when I saw them, I was like, well, I've heard of the Losers, and I think I remember just a little bit about them, but it was just a weird cameo. I was like, who is this? Who is this for? So yeah, it was interesting what they chose to give time to, who they chose to give cameos to, what they do lean into of the Super Friends and the DC animated universe is very brief, and I did feel some emotion connected to my investment in those things, but it felt a little, too little too late. However, I need to say that the first 30 minutes had some deaths and some losses that were really given some emotional weight in terms of how long, in terms of the pacing of those scenes, in terms of the performances in those scenes and the writing, just that they were allowed to have this focus of emotional weight instead of constantly rock'em sock'em, action. Now, those weighty moments were given weight substantially by my 40 plus years of DC fandom, but I still found them effective. And I think that's fair for them to assume that a viewer like me is going to bring that with them and they can tap into that. I think that's totally fair. It also took a surprising turn in the story, acknowledging the final events of the last DC animated universe iteration, which was inspired heavily by the New 52, which I have mixed feelings about the source material there, the New 52, but that series of animated movies, there was a lot that I really liked there, and especially its powerful ending. And so I was not expecting kind of like a callback, more than a callback, but like, hey, actually what's going on here has major connections to what came before in that animated universe. And so they won points with me just in terms of, their fidelity to acknowledging that DC era of animated movies and especially how it ended, which I found to be so powerful. So they won a lot of points with me there just personally. The ultimate threat here is not what you would expect based on what the source material of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it was something that I really appreciated because of its connection to a villain of the DC universe that I've always really loved. And I won't say more than that, but I found it very gratifying as a DC fan and of this particular character. It was just increasingly obvious as I watched this movie that I would be getting more out of it if I had watched more Tomorrowverse movies. Maybe I will someday. There's reasons that keep me from doing that, and I'll get to that when we talk about the visuals. The story, although it was, from my perspective, overly complicated from trying to fit in too many characters for the sake of nostalgia or connection to the source material, it still surprised me by ending this trilogy in a way that gave it weight and sort of retroactively validated parts 1 and 2 and maybe even other Tomorrowverse movies. I found myself thinking about Avengers Endgame and how that gave weight to some events in the Thor movies related to Thor and his relationship with his mom that I did not feel in the movies that really had those as their central plot points because there was so much jokiness going on. Well, finally, in Endgame, they allowed Thor to really feel some things and go to some heavier places, and it like retroactively made me want to go back and watch those movies and appreciate them more, knowing that even if they weren't giving the weight in those moments to what was happening, that eventually the weight would be properly acknowledged and there would be some explanation for why they weren't giving weight for it at the time. Like, I can't remember if this was the reason, but like Thor, he just wasn't coping with it. He wasn't ready to really face it. Well, he does finally face some of these, really heavy thoughts and things in Endgame. Similarly, I don't know that it recontextualized the first two movies, but it had a similar effect where I was like, man, I'm really feeling the weight of these things here. And it made me want to go back and give those other two another try and maybe allow them to have a more effect on me somehow if I can, knowing that they were going to give some weighty treatment to things, especially in this third movie. So it was an interesting experience and how what it did for my thoughts of the first two parts of this trilogy. There was real loss in this movie, and everyone was contemplating their end, although with less weight than at the end of Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, which was the movie that closed out the last DC animated universe. That was freaking bleak at the end of that. And this was heavy, and it was like, this is the end, but there was also the thought of, like, we will exist beyond this in some form, you know? So there was still a sense of hope that they didn't quite bring to the surface in, Apocalypse War, which I'm glad for that. I give me as heavy a story as you want, and I'll take it. I'll love it. So it wasn't as heavy and thus not as gratifying to me as Apocalypse War, but it still had that similar vibe of, oh my gosh, we're not going to come out of this clean. In fact, we're kind of losing, but there's still some hope. And I appreciate them going that route, you know. And speaking of loss, there is a cameo of Kevin Conroy's Batman. This was his last performance in terms of, I think, the publishing schedule or the release schedule. I think his voice work that he did for the Suicide Squad game was kind of being promoted as the last thing he did as Batman. And I don't know if that's because there wasn't knowledge of this project, or if because he actually recorded that last and recorded this first. I have no idea. But it does seem like this is now truly the final release of Kevin Conroy as Batman that we are going to get in any form. It was recorded, it's a brief couple of lines, and it was recorded about a year before he passed, and I read a little article about the production of that scene and how the producer, you know, if Kevin Conroy was sick and knew that he was sick, that wasn't coming out. There wasn't anything about his personality and stuff like that that would indicate that he knew he was sick, that knew he might be facing the end of his life. But man, the final lines that he speaks, very much, I would have suspected, you know, on a meta level. I was like, wow, was this? They were so on the nose of a character saying, "I know I'm going to die," you know. That it made me wonder, did they like recreate his voice with AI, and this is meant to be this kind of meta level recognition of Kevin Conroy's passing? I mean, it was really kind of strangely on the nose, but no, apparently it was not. It's just interesting how it really turned out. But anyway, so that was kind of just on a meta level an interesting kind of moment. As far as the cast and performances go, Hamill is also back as Joker, at least in that scene, although he really didn't sound like himself. I think that voice has just put him through the ringer so much over the years, as he's said as much himself, that it really has changed his voice. And so the Joker, when he was doing the Joker, I was like, oh, that doesn't quite sound. I mean, like Troy Baker might sound more like early Mark Hamill than Mark Hamill does at this point. It was kind of interesting, but yeah, I think that all the performers, though, felt solid to me. Lex Luthor didn't feel like quite the right casting, but that performance got one bust out loud guffaw laugh from me. It took me so much by surprise. Part of it was the line itself, but a lot of it was the delivery, and I just, oh man. So as far as I'm concerned, yeah, it didn't feel like the right casting for Lex Luthor, but for that line and that delivery, I was like, we're good. I am totally fine with you playing this role, because I really appreciated that. I just, again, I would briefly comment that I appreciated the actors being allowed, when appropriate to the scene, to be more flat and somber in their performance instead of over-inflecting, which can kind of just be a thing we take for granted as acceptable in animation. But their performances were allowed to really be somber at times, and I appreciated that. So really no complaints ultimately about the performances. As far as the visuals, okay, so I've commented before in talking about Tomorrowverse movies, and these movies in particular, that the thick black lines that seem very much inspired by 1960s Hanna-Barbera animation, really, I don't like them. I don't like it. It makes it all seem just kind of silly and light, because it's evoking a very silly, light era in animation. I have no idea why they went with that style for this whole Tomorrowverse era. It has just put me off of some of these movies, or at least made it hard for me to engage with the elements that otherwise I would enjoy. I might be finding them to be less grating as of this movie, or perhaps they're just dialing them back. I didn't notice them as often, as much. There were definitely a number of scenes where I was like, oh, the lines are totally thinner there. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, admittedly, the style did fit well with some flashback art styles that they went to, but I mean, not worth it enough to justify going with this style for the whole Tomorrowverse. I am really ready, I found, for 3D cell animation blends, like if you or straight up game engine visuals going forward. I think they could probably do some really cool stuff with performances if they switched over to something like that. If you look at games like Horizon Zero Dawn, Horizon Forbidden West, or the Spider-Man games on PlayStation, and you see what's going on in the performances there, I know that there's a lot of work that goes into those, and probably more work and time than animated movies. But as technology advances, I just can't help but wonder if we're getting close to a time where it will mostly just be about having the models pre-made and then just getting good enough capture technology to translate actor performances, so that we could suddenly have these animated DC movies where the emotions, the acting, the performances of the actors and the portrayals of their characters are just so much more engaging. I think if you look at the trailer for the upcoming Watchmen Chapter 1 movie, there's some things that I don't like about it, but I'm like, I am totally accepting of this as a step in the direction of where we're gonna go long term. I'm surprising myself to say that, because I have enjoyed cell animation with just maybe some CG effects thrown in. That's really been kind of like what I've preferred. But now I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready to move things forward in DC animated movies to a new way of presenting them if they want to. So let's see. This story also basically says it's the end for all and every animated DC universe that has come before. A lot of them are referenced, and some surprising ones too. So I think after these upcoming Watchmen movies, which are not going to take place in the main DC universe, I think after these Watchmen movies would be the ideal time to do something completely fresh in terms of the animation. I don't know what Creature Commandos is going to be like. That's been announced, but that's part of James Gunn's DC universe continuity, so it's sharing continuity with the live-action movies that are coming. I suspect that at least for a while, they're not going to want to muddy the waters by having a parallel animated ongoing DC continuity. So we'll probably get some one-offs. And I would like that not to need to be the case, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was. So I don't know that we're looking at a new beginning right away for a new DC animated continuity, but certainly the pieces are in place for that to happen, and I think it would be a good time to change up the animation style, give us a fresh start. All right. Themes. Is there anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance in the themes of this thing that could trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? Well, not really this time. It does not, I don't think, pay off the theistic or theistically influenced teases or inspirations that I think I was picking up in the last two. Just some interesting, you can watch or listen to my reviews of the last two to see what I was talking about there. This time it just brushes on some ideas that, very briefly, that I think beg to be explored or expanded on, but aren't in this script. Lex has a very interesting comment about Darwinism, that it's just been interesting in the last 10 to 15 years to see when Darwinism is paired with a villain. And that's because certainly through many, many years of Star Trek, that has not been the case. Another sci-fi that really holds up Darwin and the belief in complete naturalistic selection, naturalistic evolution and origins of life. Yeah, so it's just interesting to see that kind of naturalistic viewpoint being paired with villains, maybe equally today, compared to more positive type characters. There was a weird comment that seemed to kind of go nowhere. They have this big Deus Ex Machina device that they need to get working to solve all their problems. And one character says, it needs power, but how? And Dr. Fate says, do you truly not know? There is only one power that creates something out of nothing. And I'm like, that is like a classic, that's almost the Kalam cosmological argument, or it's getting really close to laying the groundwork for talking about the Kalam cosmological argument. But then it seems to go nowhere. Constantine is the next character that says something, and he says, of course, it, meaning this machine, wants a sacrifice. And I'm like, wait, what? What do you mean? There is only one power that creates something out of nothing. What is that? The power of sacrifice? I don't know. It's the weird connective tissues I'm not seeing there. I just did not know where the dialogue was going. It seemed to be wanting to touch on some really deep philosophical ideas, or I don't know. That was a weird moment that went nowhere. And then there's an immortal character who is willing to make a sacrifice of their life, who says that, wouldn't this sacrifice, basically, given that I have been unable to die and I'm just going to live forever, wouldn't ending my life, basically, or in this way, I think in particular, but still ending my life, give my life meaning? And so the idea that the end of her life would give it meaning, sorry, I've narrowed it down to who the character is. The idea that ending her life would give it meaning is an idea that's consistent with the claim by some atheists that the brief, finite nature of life, its scarcity of days, gives it value. Just like the scarcity of gold, the scarcity of diamonds gives those things value. But it's still, when that claim is made, it still only gives those things subjective value. We give value to gold and diamonds because we want them. Because yes, there being less of them than other minerals is like a major factor of that, but it's still our subjective desire for those things. They don't have objective value. And so the brevity of human life, or the fact that human life ends, at most can only give it this subjective emotional value and speak to our desire for it, but not to its objective value. So anyway, yeah, but that, again, that wasn't like all these ideas wasn't explored. I think the final thing that struck me was that these characters were contemplating their end, much like people speculate on the afterlife, because they were being told, well, you're going to exist in a form after this. But then they were, like looking at each other and asking the types of questions like, will we know each other in this thing, this existence we're moving on to? Will I still be me? And I think these are the kinds of questions, the kinds of thoughts that some people have when they think about the afterlife, or some Christians might, I think mistakenly, ask these questions about themselves regarding heaven. But in terms of what the Bible reveals about our eternal state, there's no reason to think that we're going to be absorbed into some ultra being and not be ourselves anymore, or that we will be so changed that we won't have our own personalities. I mean, we'll have all the positive aspects of our personalities, and we'll leave the negative aspects behind, but we will be more us than we've ever been able to be. We will, so, and knowing each other, it seems obvious that there's no reason to think we would not know each other. Maybe there's a little bit of deduction you have to do there, looking at the resurrected body of Jesus, and speculate a little bit there. So maybe there's some room for questions there, but I think ultimately, yes, absolutely, we have every reason to think that we will know each other. But these are still the kinds of questions that people ask, both Christians and non-Christians, as they contemplate the idea of continuing to exist after this life. So yeah, I think there's some personal resonance there, if not a great opportunity to really reflect on some real life issues. All right. No idea what your tastes are in animation or movies or whatever, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, watch this one. It will make it worth your time, surprisingly, to have watched parts 1 and 2. I mean, you didn't hate those. They just kind of fell short and were just kind of there. But this one really caps it off in a way that, while not perfectly, and has some of the same mess, really validates the time that you spent and the investment in this trilogy. But wait. Wait for the, I think, probable combined Blu-ray collection of all three. And even then, maybe when it's on sale. All right, well, this one is rated PG-13 for some violence and language. And those are all my thoughts for now on Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining over at patreon.com/SpiritBladeProductions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.